I want to start with a regular confession that I make these days when I stand up to speak in front of any audience, and that is to confess how deeply, deeply nervous I am. Significantly more nervous than I was when I was a 15-year-old activist standing up against the inequality in education in South Africa, when the slogan at the front of the march was "We want equality," and by the time the younger kids at the back of the march, the 12-year-olds, they were chanting "We want a color TV," because they thought that was the slogan in the front of the march. Well, kids in white schools had color TVs, kids in black schools had no TVs, and if I'm brutally honest with you, at that moment in my life, I wanted a color TV and equality almost equally. But why am I nervous? Best to do it through a story. Speaking to an audience in the US, I talk about the fact that we are running out of time on climate, that our forests are disappearing, inequality is deepening, and as I'm talking about all of this, you could see the audience getting more and more depressed. And then when the Q&A time came, a woman put up a hand and asked me, she said, "Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" I said, "Yes, he inspired me and many young activists in South Africa when we were fighting against the apartheid regime." And she asked, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" And thinking it was a trick question. Anybody?
I have a dream.
Yes, but I was thinking it's a bit of a trick question, so I said it a bit more gently. I said, I have a dream. And then she shouted back at me. She said, "Yes, it's I have a dream, but when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. Everything is collapsing, everything's getting worse," and so on. Therein lies the biggest challenge of the moment that humanity finds itself in. How do we speak in an honest, truthful way, speak the truth to the power that needs to be spoken, but how do we do it in a way that does not depress, demobilize, and undermine what we really need to do right now, which is create a context of hope, a context of it does matter that if we all get involved and that we all have a place and an opportunity to contribute to what has to be the biggest effort at mobilization of people to put pressure on those who have power to make major changes quickly. Now, I noticed that I've done exactly what I've did at the US. Some of you are looking depressed. So let me just quickly tell you, let me just give you some good news. You've probably heard people like myself at some point have said things like, save the planet, save the environment, save the climate. The good news, dear brothers and sisters, is the planet is absolutely fine. The planet actually does not need saving. If we continue on the path that we are, we continue to warm up this planet to a point where our water resources are depleted, as is happening in many parts of the world already. Our soil gets depleted, as is happening on my continent, Africa, on a serious scale already, and as happened in Syria 7 years before the conflict started. And end result is we're not able to produce food. And so the end result is we will be gone. The planet actually will still be here. And the good news is once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So don't worry about the planet. Understand that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing less and nothing more than ensuring that humanity can fashion a way to coexist with nature in a mutually interdependent relationship for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is simply a commitment that we need to make to securing our children and their children's futures. That is what is at stake at the moment. The good news is the solutions are there today for us to be able to rise to meet this challenge. The bad news is the industries that are making truckloads of money every single second of every single day are holding us back from making the transitions that we need to make. And sadly, too many of our political leaders have been bought lock, stock, and barrel by the very holders who dominate these polluting industries. Now, where do creatives fit in? I want to take you to France in the 70s when a philosopher there called Louis Althusser made, at the height of his powers, intellectual powers, made this distinction where he said one of the mistakes that many people make is thinking that governments and corporations control people by mainly using what he called the repressive state apparatus. By the repressive state apparatus, he meant the framework for education, army, police, use of formal laws, and so on. But he said, of course, the repressive state apparatus does create the theater where citizens can seek to secure their rights and advocate for them. However, he argued that the more insidious and more powerful form of control is, in fact, the ideological state apparatus, by which he defined as the framework for education, the framework for schooling, and the framework for particularly media. So when we look at activism and what does activism really mean, activism at one level is nothing more than ensuring a massive, creative awareness effort to ensure that people understand their rights, know how to fight for them, and know how to connect with others to do so. And generally, we tend to think that governments control more in terms of the repressive state apparatus, and we don't understand the power of culture in moving societies forward. Now, I want to shock you a bit by saying that I fully support Steve Bannon when he asserts that politics follows culture, culture does not follow politics, right? And I believe that they have been significantly, Bannon and his ilk have been much more successful in understanding popular communications than people who are concerned about gender equality and other progressive issues such as addressing climate change. So when they shoot out a dog whistle, such as Make America Great Again, which the base knows that the message is Make America White Again. I mean, if you want to make America great again, you probably have to give the country back to the indigenous original peoples of the United States. So that's a much more complicated project. But the bottom line is, a lot of the climate activism communications have not been accessible enough, have not been creative enough, and has not been impactful enough. And I want to say to you, if any of you sitting in this audience here thinking, oh, this guy Kumi is in such an important role and you know, you're looking to me to be somebody who's going to add value, let me be blunt with you. Right now, and I'm not saying this to be polite and to make you feel good about yourselves, but I hope you will feel good about yourselves, even though that was not my intention. Basically, to be blunt with you, I would argue that each and every one of you here have much more power to make a difference than you probably fully acknowledge. That if activism is nothing more than ensuring that people who have been shut out of knowledge, information, and so on, which enables them to see how serious things are, how unjust things are, and how they can act against it. If we don't break that, then activism is dead, and you have the capability to help us engage in that communication. So in South Africa, for example, during the struggle against apartheid, where the majority of our people were left unable to read and write when democracy came, you know, how do you mobilize in a context where the majority of people cannot read and write? Of course, it's arts and culture. It's music. It's dance. I remember speaking at a meeting in Reading, which Bernard Shaw, I think, or George, Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw said that the only reason people went to Reading was to change trains for London, or Oxford, depending which direction you're going, because he spent some nights in a prison in Reading, but let me not get too deviated from that. But the bottom line is, I got asked, why is it, I was speaking about the situation, why is it that your people sing and dance at funerals? I don't know whether you remember in the 80s, you know, every weekend we were in burying activists, and at the activist funerals, you would see people singing and dancing. It was to say to the oppressor, you can do whatever you want to do to us, you're never going to break our spirit. It was saying to the families that you should feel proud. You should celebrate the life of your family member because it was a life well lived, and even though it's taken prematurely, you should honor his commitment. And it's basically saying to ourselves that we're going to keep smiling, we're going to keep loving each other, we're going to keep living while we fight the injustice of apartheid. So a couple of weeks ago, Amnesty International gave Fridays for the Future and Greta Thunberg its highest honor called the Ambassador of Conscience Award. And it was given to every country where this movement exists, including here in the UK, to the young leaders of that movement. And when I was handing over the award in Washington, DC to Greta and the US Fridays for Future movement, I said, if I was a dictator, there's one thing that I would instruct you to do as the Fridays for the Future movement, which is do not allow the Trumps of the world and the Bolsonaros of the world and the Boris Johnsons of the world to deprive you of your childhood. And there's one thing, if I could decree that you do, is while we fight this fight, let's have as much fun as possible. Make sure we're laughing. And I say it from my experience as a young activist in South Africa. You know, people sometimes say, oh, you've been involved since you're 15, you've sacrificed and contributed. Folks, if I gave this much to the cause of humanity, what I've received in return is I can't even make it big enough, okay? So what I'm saying is activism is fun, activism is sexy, activism is what we need. And I believe that the creative community, I'm seeing more and more evidence of people in the broadest creative community wanting to contribute, wanting to participate, and so on. I want to conclude by saying, apart from how you use the different tools of your trade, at the center of it is what is the core message? What is the core message that we need to communicate at this moment where clearly our young children are saying to us, you don't get it. Our future is going. You keep talking about growth, which is a fairy tale, that we have reached the limits of growth and so on. And I don't know whether any of you saw Greta Thunberg's speech at the UN. If you haven't, I strongly urge you to see it, because it was truth to power, emotionally, powerfully, and so on. And so I want to just evoke back to Martin Luther King, if I might. Speaking in the mid-60s, he said, my friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to be well-adjusted and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you that there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to. He then goes on to say, I never intend to adjust myself. Sorry, I think I pressed it by mistake. He then goes on to say, I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to racial discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to a mindless expenditure on military weapons when people have no food to eat. And importantly, on the economy, he said, I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. He was talking about the US in the mid-60s. If it was relevant then, it's 1,000 times more relevant in the US today, and sadly, it's relevant for every country on this planet. So when we think about what the creative community can contribute, I believe you have only begun to scratch the surface of what you can communicate. And one of the things that in the activist community we're not good at is we tend to speak too much in jargon. I like to think I'm a little bit of an exception, but as you can see, I've used a few big words already. And by the way, Martin Luther King, in a longer version of the speech, called on the setting up of a new international movement that never got set up. He said, I call upon people around the world to come together to set up a new international movement to be known as the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. So your challenge is to be creatively maladjusted, to be comfortable, not to adjust to the status quo, recognize that things are so broken that they require fundamental change. So what we need right now is not system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. What we need is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. This is not a time for baby steps in the right direction. This is not a time for rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while humanity sinks. This is a time for major, bold decisions that are at the scale of what the science is telling us we need to change. So let me leave you, in conclusion, with a little story that keeps me motivated every day, because one of the questions that I get asked all the time is, how is it for people who have been committed to these issues and have been working, how do you keep your sense of motivation? And I just want to conclude on a true story. It's a sad, but focus on the inspirational stuff. Don't worry about the sad stuff. So I was 22 years old. I'm fleeing South Africa into exile, and my best friend at that time, a guy called Lenny, asks me a question. He says, Kumi, what is the biggest contribution we can make to the cause of humanity? And I say, that's a simple question, giving our life. He said, you mean going, participating in a demonstration and getting shot and killed, which, as I said, was happening all the time at that time in South Africa in the 80s. I said, I guess so. He said, no, it's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. I was 22 years old that time. My friend Lenny was way ahead of me in every possible way. In fact, he was the first environmentalist I met. At that time, you know, green issues were like totally irrelevant for him. He got the connection between the different issues. And I jokingly say, I think at that time he probably was like one of 5,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent. So a guy was a visionary, so we hug each other, we say goodbye, we fled into exile in different directions. And then 2 years later, I get the call while I was a student at Oxford University, telling me that my friend Lenny and 3 young women from my home city were brutally murdered by the apartheid regime. There were so many bullets in their bodies, their parents couldn't even recognize them at the mortuary. So I had to think hard about the distinction that he was making between giving your life versus giving the rest of your life. And what he was saying is very profound, that the struggle for justice, climate justice, gender justice, social justice, environmental justice, you name it, these struggles are marathons and they're not sprints. And the biggest commitment each and every one can make here is to move forward with a sense of perseverance, stamina, and energy to continue to push until we secure this planet for our children and their children in a more just and more equitable way. And so, you know, when I got the call that he had died, I had to think deeply about this distinction. And what I say to you is the fact that you are here on a Monday morning or Monday afternoon for the session gives me hope. It is saying that you are prepared to be part of the solution rather than opting to be neutral and right now taking a position of neutrality when there is so much at stake, I would argue, is a choice of saying that you're part of the problem. So I want to conclude by inviting you to be as active as possible, to look at all the creative options before you, prepare and budget for setbacks, because there will be setbacks, but just budget for it in your psychology so that when it comes, you say, this is a setback I was waiting for. Because we are going to have fun, we're going to be as creative as possible, we are going to be as motivated as possible as we do what it takes to ensure that we create a world where there's more equity, more sustainability, and where our children can live in love and in peace. Thank you very, very much.
So I feel like we have assembled a panel of people who are already part of the creative maladjusted, who are already people who have made that commitment and stepped forward in different and interlocking ways. I'm going to quickly just say a few words about each of you so that that context is clear for the audience. So Lily, you've been, and I'm going to come to you to find out a bit more about this, but I feel like the last few years you've done a big sort of pivot towards this area, and not only been writing about this. I've seen stuff you've written in The Guardian. You've also been in a short film. I think you're working with the Environmental Justice Foundation. I saw your call on UK banks to take climate change more seriously, which obviously we should all be boycotting and divesting from Barclays. And also working on a digital children's book. So you're really like in lots of touch points there. And I'm going to come to you more to explain what your moment was to kind of pivot into that work. Livia, so your work in this area, again, goes back, I think, probably more than 10 years. And you'll tell us a bit more about the work of EcoAge. But I'm just going to highlight just now the work that you've done with the Green Carpet Challenge, because that's, again, going back to 2010 when you actually I'm not going to walk on red carpets anymore in kind of in fashion wear, which is upholding a system which is ultimately unsustainable. And I think through that you've done a lot of really interesting high-level influencing, and I was telling Kumi about the work you've done as well to flip some of the gold companies to thinking more sustainably. So you've really been a kind of an activist, but one with really interesting access to the creative worlds of fashion and film. And Duncan, a playwright and a screenwriter, and your play Lungs is coming back, I think, to the Old Vic any second now, actually, I think on the 14th of October. And that's a play which will be starring Matt Smith and Claire Foy, and really a couple who are wrestling with what climate change means for the future of their relationship and any plans they might have kind of for family. And you also, I think, a few years ago did another play called 2071, which was a dramatised lecture that you actually collaborated with a climate scientist. And Scott, you've been involved in a lot of really big, amazing films with big mainstream success. You've worked a lot with Matt Damon and Steven Soderbergh, and I'm sure people would know those films. Films like The Bourne Ultimatum and Contagion. I feel like all of your work, obviously deeply social and political. And in terms of climate, you actually were involved in the making of An Inconvenient Truth and its sequel. So on the documentary side too, you've really been very directly kind of involved in this work. So firstly, I think on behalf of me and Kumi, thank you for all of the work that you guys are already doing. But I wanted to kind of jump in with this question in terms of what brought us to this moment. Lily, what made you realise this was something? How many years ago, and what was the kind of inciting moment when you realised you needed to kind of pivot your attention to this work?
It's interesting that you observe it as a pivot. For me, it's felt like a very sustained pivot that I'm still on. That for me started when I was a teenager, because I started modelling when I was very young. I was 14, and I suddenly was in this position. Before I started modelling, I once wrote to Amnesty asking if I could do something to help. I had a very kind of activist mum, and I didn't get a reply. It kind of went nowhere.
Do you want to reply now?
I will send you the reply now.
Thanks. And then suddenly I found myself in this position when I started modelling, that suddenly loads of charities were writing to me and asking if I could help and be involved. And kind of naturally, how do you say no to all the different things that call our heart and attention, whether it's animal rights or human rights or the environment. And the environment had almost been the least interesting, because it's like the least emotional. But I did a kind of sustained few years of working with different charities to try and be helpful, but also for myself to really try and work out where I felt I could add value, or I felt like the biggest calling. And for me, certainly I came out of that journey, and it was the environment, because I just realized that the environment is kind of the underpinning to everything else. And every other kind of social issue is made worse by an unhealthy environment. And also it's just kind of like, do we want to live, right? It's like the most fundamental question. So I started working with the Environmental Justice Foundation. I think when I was like 17 or 18, I became a patron for them, and WWF and a few different organizations. And then since then, I've always tried to, I guess, take the approach of, can you change the system from inside? So continuing to work with fashion, working with film, think about kind of, rather than being on the outside, how do you try and change systems from within? Which I'm not saying I've had kind of varying success at different projects I've done, but I've always been looking at it through that lens, and that's taken me on a journey really for the last 10, 15 years that I still say I'm on.
And how are you dealing with it all emotionally? Because I thought it was interesting that a lot of what Kumi is talking about here is the need to actually set ourselves emotionally. for this struggle, because it's tough, right? I mean, I'm beginning to work with a lot of climate scientists and people like Kumi who spend every minute of every day with their head in it, and I see what an enormous kind of challenge that is. How are you feeling? It's been an amazing year, right? There's been a lot moving. Are you feeling energized by that, or the climate reports are getting worse at the same time that the kids are out on the street? It's a lot, right?
I think it's such an important question. I think it's the question that probably as creatives we have to really strive to try and answer, because I think it's a really challenging moment to be alive and to be cognizant of what's happening. And I've really definitely struggled with a mix of emotions. I think at times I felt incredibly depressed of a 4-year-old child, and the kind of just the weight of it when you get deep into the science and the information is so heavy. The anxiety, hypocrisy, guilt, like analysing my own life, beating myself up about the points that I feel part of the problem rather than the solution. And then pulling myself out of that and feeling actually really energized and optimistic, because people, by and large, do feel like they're waking up, and it feels like there's a massive mainstream movement that didn't exist 10 years ago. I mean, obviously, there's been a huge environmental movement for decades, but it's becoming really mainstream. I've been writing a book, actually, on environmental solutions for the last 3 years, and as I've been writing the book, it's just, transformed the whole landscape. I've had to keep rewriting sections and chapters. I have a whole chapter now on protest that didn't exist when I conceptualized the book, because the Fridays for the Future and Extinction Rebellion didn't exist. So I kind of mix of things. I try and control my emotions rather than allow them to control me. And so when I'm trying to control them, I focus on the positive, and I feel really optimistic and energized by the fact that there are actually tons of solutions, and it seems like people care, and that gives me great hope.
Thank you. I'm not going to go down the line. It's too predictable. I'm going to jump to Duncan. So Duncan, again, just give us that kind of sense about when you first got involved in this area, and also how you're feeling in this current moment. How are you feeling?
I'm similarly. I mean, I've got a 5-year-old, and I'm feeling I'm feeling both things at once. Absolutely despairing, and yet looking at the generation now below me and what's happening with Extinction Rebellion just down the road, despair doesn't seem to be an option, and that's incredibly inspiring. That we have to just be asking these questions. We have to be active. We have to be doing things right now. I find that really inspiring. I can't pinpoint exactly the moment. Certainly as a dramatist, it's as a screenwriter or as a playwright, I've been thinking a lot for a long time now about how we talk about this stuff. I think there's 3 real problems we have as storytellers in dealing with this. There's, first of all, it's very complicated to try and communicate something like the carbon cycle in a drama where people are standing in a kitchen chopping peppers or something and having an argument, and also trying to explain the carbon cycle to each other is narratively difficult to make compelling. It's also been quite abstract for a long time, and I think I think stories, particularly plays and films, do the individual better than they do the collective, and they do the concrete better than they do the abstract. And so you get lots of narratives about usually violent men who are solving things through force and making a huge change by being the only one with real agency. And that's not going to be the case here. It's going to be a collective thing and a restructuring. So our stories, I suppose, particularly Western story structure, is inadequate for telling stories which can communicate the collective, can communicate the complexity, can elucidate the abstract, and can communicate the science in that way. So I think just like we need sort of economic restructuring and political restructuring, we need a sort of restructuring of our stories, and that's something I'm finding really inspiring as well by the generation below me in theatre and in film. They are finding new forms, they're finding new ways of telling stories. The writers themselves, the directors, the makers, and the protagonists of their stories are people we've not seen that much before, and I feel as a white, heterosexual, middle-class, educated, English-speaking, able-bodied, cisgendered man, I'm finding it
You said that
fascinating.
really well. You've said that before.
Well, yeah, but someone who accidentally got born into a set of privileges that I'm now trying to reckon with and now trying to understand, trying to work out how to use those privilege to give voice to people who don't have that same collective bingo card, and that is it's fascinating. The voices that are coming up and the voices that are finally being given that space. And I think that change to form and the change to the voices who are able to contribute now and be heard in our culture. So yeah, I'm trying to work out how as an artist and as a maker of things, I can step aside, listen more, and give that voice to other people as much as possible.
I'm going to bounce off that and come to Scott. Scott, where do you live normally? You in Los Angeles or New York or...?
Mainly in Los Angeles.
Okay. So obviously we're very grateful to have you here today. It's because your latest film, The Report, is in the film festival that brings you to this panel today. And actually when I heard Duncan saying stories of violent men using force to solve things, I thought actually that's the subject of your film, The Report, which of course is about the CIA and their use of torture. Obviously, the opposite of heroising such thing. So I'd love to talk to you more about that film later, because that's an area that I'm sort of super interested in as well. But given that you were involved in An Inconvenient Truth, and I've been reflecting a lot on documentaries, which is our area, and I feel like there's been a real narrow way that documentaries have approached this subject, even ones, when I look back in horror that I've been involved in, and there tends to be a kind of like fear, hope kind of structure and really quite a narrow look at this. And what were your reflections on hearing what Duncan is saying, that actually our very story forms are kind of maybe are too narrow to help us kind of capture this? Is that something that you're vibe with, or you just think we haven't used our imagination enough within the forms that we already have?
Well, I guess having heard what Duncan said, the first thing I want to say is I feel absurdly redundant because he and I have the same sort of CV. So in a way, I think the best thing I could do right now is put down the microphone and invite somebody who's not from the experience of a white cisgendered male to come up here. So if there's anybody who wants my seat, I've learned that the thing you have to do now actually to make a difference is give up your space if it's already been occupied by someone who's like-minded, so that we have other voices. And I'm actually completely serious right now, so if there is a woman or person of color who wants to come up here, I will step aside. If not, I will prattle on. But yeah, you're right. I think that one of the things that I've learned from the work I've done in the documentary space on An Inconvenient Truth, An Inconvenient Sequel, Food Inc., a number of other docs that I've consulted on, it does start to follow this recipe where at the end we get to this place where, someone says, well, you got to leave them with hope. And I have a real problem with hope. And actually Greta said it very well the other day that, hope without action is meaningless. I have a friend who has cancer who says hope is people waiting for the bus. And to me, I've been working on a project with Bill McKibben, who is an activist in the States, and Bill says we don't owe the audience hope, we owe the audience honesty. And one of the things that we said in An Inconvenient Truth was we worked with James Hansen, who is a NASA scientist, but also the IPCC scientists who I worked with have always said there was a 10-year threshold. So that was 2005. Okay, so we went over that threshold. And I think what's important to realize is that you can't rely on the science and then pretend that it isn't happening. And so we did go over that threshold. And so now the negotiation we're involved in is how do we stop the worst ravages of climate change? And that we can do, but we need plans and we need solutions. And so, this is something that I've, been really involved with for 20 years. And, I can tell you that Dennis Hayes, who created Earth Day in America, when Dennis put solar panels on the White House in 1976, his hope was that someday we would have an Eden and that he's an economist, and he thought we would come up with a sustainable economy. I spoke to Dennis last week, and he said, really, my hope now is that we survive. And I say this not to scare people, because what you said about motivation is crucial. But I think we need to tell stories that take into account that reality and make it motivating. And in that regard, I feel really embarrassed that I failed. You know, I really do. Like, I've got to figure out ways to tell stories that human beings engage with, that make them, you know, do something other than what we're doing.
Livia, I feel like, you know, you are the another eco activist on this panel, but one who's really had a very close ringside seat to the kind of world of film. What have your observations been about the changes or the resistance, you know, in that world to kind of pivoting to face these subjects and to kind of invent stories? And obviously, it must be something that you talk about a lot at the kitchen table.
Yeah, but it's also a very interesting experience that I had. I mean, in my previous career life, I was a documentary producer. I think this is when we met more than 12 years ago. And at the time, I was producing a documentary against the death penalty in America, and Amnesty was part of that. And one thing that I realized at the time was that there were plenty of environmental, social, political movies and documentaries that didn't have a platform to get distributed and to be seen. And this is when I think I met you, and with this idea to create a platform called Bright White at the time, where we could show these movies and then link them immediately with action, because at the end of the movie you are highly emotional and you want to act and do something, and then you think, what do I do? So you could link it immediately to the action. Then that failed. And in that same period, my brother had the idea of opening EcoAge, this environmental consultancy company. And I always felt that I've been an activist first and foremost, as you say, a professional agitator. And the first time I started learning about environmental issue and realizing that environmental issues are human rights issues. It's all, you know, they're so linked. You can't only talk about climate justice without talking about social justice. And one of the things that I started understanding as I was studying is that every single day we do two things, right? We get dressed and we eat. So if as citizens we take an action with both these two acts, simple act, then, you know, you touch on Food Inc., the documentary you help producing, you touch on, you know, documentaries at the time, The End of the Line. That was, I can't remember, it was so many years ago, about overfishing. And then with clothes, it was the same. It's like, okay, hold on a second. I get dressed every day. The fashion industry is one of the most polluting industry in the world, like almost like oil, the oil industry and mining industry. So when I found myself on the red carpets, I thought, okay, I can promote this issue through walking on the red carpet. You want fashion to talk about human rights? I'll give you fashion. And that's how we started. And then obviously, in our experience with EcoAge, we started consulting on a lot of different companies, a lot of different subjects, from mining, as you say, with gold mining, diamonds, or whatever. But in 2014, I had the privilege to produce this documentary called The True Cost, which is on Netflix. And Netflix and all the other platforms changed the way that today we consume movies. So 12 years ago, when the idea of Bright White, you were working and it was the biggest struggle. And I think this is why the creative industry took so long to catch up, because you were sweating years to do the most incredible movie, and then no one would distribute it, and you didn't know what to see it. And it was a real labor of love. Today is so much easier because you put it online.
You and I both know that for audiences who do watch feature documentaries, they are very, very affected by them. We both know that, kind of Kumi knows that too. But I think what's interesting to me is how do we break this storytelling in a way out of that documentary kind of ghetto?
Well,
and how do we get it much more into every other part of culture? Because we know what we do is powerful in documentary, but that's not going to reach everyone with the best. Even with Netflix, the best willing. Well, I mean, these guys are kind of nodding regretfully.
But I
It's
think
true.
today, because of Greta Thunberg, because of all the movement and the students, the audience has grown so much more. I think even us, we don't realize about that power. And when I produced The True Cost, which was about the impact of the fashion industry and as an environmental and social catastrophe, that documentary has been distributed in 64 countries and is still one of the most watched. And it took us all by surprise, but because people want to know, and once you find something creatively that really grasps your attention and inspire you, you start talking about it, and and I think today we have an even more bigger responsibility as a creative industry to act and tell these stories, because I know you are behind the Great Hack documentary.
I had
as
a
well.
small role.
Your small role. But I don't know how many of you have watched the Great Hack documentary. If you haven't, please go and watch it on Netflix. But it's how we have been today we are totally manipulated and through social media and the way that we act online. So the power of movies is even more important to take us out of that, stupid smartphone that we live on, to really understand what's happening to us.
Yes, Viva documentaries. But yeah, my frustration and the reason that I've been doing this work with Kumi is to really try to kind of widen this out to every other part of the creative industries. And in fact, some of the people that we invited down to the ICA, people who work on the soaps, actually the Archers. Anyone here an Archers listener? No one will admit to it. One brave woman. Two brave people will admit to it. But they've got a sustainable farming storyline, and actually, this is we need everything in song lyrics. We need everything kind of everywhere. And I feel like documentary's long been the vanguard, but we have to, if we can't kind of disseminate more widely,
Look at the
we're
power
not going to get there.
Attenborough's Blue Planet. I mean, today we know about plastic. We could argue because of him. We are all become so much more active on plastic because of him.
But we should all be lobbying the BBC to do more too. Lily.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with that point and say, actually, I've found things recently as comedy, and a few comedians who are just being very funny and intensely political at the same time is so effective. And I think we do need a cross-pollination, because I love documentaries personally, but we can't change the world through just documentaries, because they have usually their own audiences, and there are certain people who just don't watch documentaries. So as you say, music, comedy, we need to think cross-sector. And I was actually just thinking about fashion, and I don't mean fashion in terms of clothes, but hearing you talk, me and Livia have known each other for years. We're kind of the early community of eco-fashion people, which thankfully has grown massively. And I don't mean fashion in the narrow sense of what we wear, but rather fashion in terms of culture. Yeah, what's fashionable, what behavior is fashionable, which includes human rights and gender equality and the different kind of fashionable ways we collectively think about problems. And in my experience, when reflecting on your point about how difficult this story has been to tell across all sectors, I feel like it's suffered from being incredibly unfashionable for a long time. When I was first starting working in kind of sustainability, it was a kind of cliche of a hemp dress, and my agent, I remember being like, "Oh, aren't you worried that you're eating? Was it biting the hand that feeds you?" There was this kind of sense that it was almost being niche and negative, not in a good way. And I think it's become incredibly fashionable. And with that, I think there's hope that, across all sectors, whether it's the radio or music or painters or, all of the different thinkers will bring this in subtle or obvious ways into their work, I hope.
Well, on Wednesday at the London Film Festival, there's the Michael Winterbottom movie Greed, which is all about this. It's about fashion. It's loosely inspired by, not really, but Philip Green is the story of Topshop, basically. And today in The Guardian, there is a story about, Michael is giving an interview saying that Sony actually censors the movie at the end, because, the movie is a comedy, so you laugh throughout the whole film, and then at the end you get hit really, really hard with the truth, and you think, oh shit, I've been laughing about these things that are really, and you get hit at the end with all the stats, the owner of H&M is the richest man on the planet, and a garment worker in Bangladesh earns, $60 a month, and all of that. And Sony made Michael take it away. And so it's one of the power of the creative industry. So, we're living with the politics inside our industry as well.
Well, just a couple of thoughts. I mean, one, one of the things, and when An Inconvenient Truth came out, we had a long talk about why we didn't have anybody from the other side, which I found one of the most amazing questions I've ever been asked. And I said, if we had made a documentary about gravity, would you have wanted somebody from the other side? And where could I meet that person?
There will be that person too. There will be the anti-gravity people.
Sure
yeah.
there are.
Yeah.
But my concern sometimes is, that, and some of these documentaries, like I said, are really great. There is a corruption of the form, though, that we're actively participating in. And because ultimately these things tend to represent our views, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, it just we are turning the act of making a documentary, if, you go back and look at a film like The Titicut Follies that was made in the States in the 60s about mental illness, ostensibly, we are losing what a documentary film is, just like we are losing an idea about what news is. And, in the case of an existential issue like climate change, maybe that's worth it. But I think the larger issue here is that we need to figure out a way to tell stories. It's really interesting. If a writer were to write a great book about climate change, and I mean a novelist, and there's a great essay about this by a writer named Amitav Ghosh called The Great Derangement that I encourage anybody to read. But there were great novels written about World War II, and they helped us understand what World War II meant. Now, if a writer were to write a great book about climate change, you would find it in which section? You'd find it in science fiction. And if you talk to a writer, science fiction somehow, and this is not fair, but science fiction is sort of, not as sophisticated and serious as literature. And so I think that we have to look at how we're doing this. And what I'm trying to do now is recognize that a lot of the stories that we're telling really are climate change stories. We just haven't connected the dots. Syria and the immigration problem that Europe is facing, in any long view, is a climate change problem, because farms failed and people moved into cities and there were problems. In America, where we talk about this caravan, well, a lot of this is because farms are failing in Latin America, and nobody wants to walk to the United States of America, now less than ever. And so why would someone walk there? Well, it's because their way of life is in jeopardy. And when you talk to people at the United Nations, they are very serious about, look what 2 million refugees from Syria did to Europe in the last few years. What do we think is going to happen when we have 20 million refugees by 2040 or 2050 from Indonesia? So starting there, starting at the human problem, rather at the scientific side of it, is probably a good way to go. I think every problem and that a writer might consider, and every conflict and every relationship is going to start to be influenced by climate change. And so I think we have to sort of flip the script a little bit and start looking at the human stories that we tell and see how climate change is going to impact them.
But why do we think we haven't yet seen these bold, imaginative, different ways of understanding the current impacts or the future? Why do we feel we haven't seen these stories? Is it, as Duncan says, that actually this is genuinely difficult and different for writers to contend with? Have writers not really grasped that this is where they need to apply themselves? Is it the kind of the Sonys and the people who are actually we don't want to go there? Is it a combination of these things? And how do we how do we create a new kind of wave and moment? Of course, famously, you know, the New Deal, FDR included huge money for artists. You know, the voice of storytellers and novelists and painters, and was part of that. And people are calling for that in a kind of a Green New Deal. How do we inspire and convince people at all levels in the kind of chains to move this forward? Or are we misunderstanding what the barriers are? Are they within us as creatives, or are they inside the system?
I mean, I have a question for Duncan, who I've never met before, but I really want to see her play. But I think for me as a writer, you know, your first impulse is Cormac McCarthy's first impulse, which is do dystopia. You know, go to what you think the end is. And we certainly saw that. And, you know, dystopia was easy to imagine, an easy fruit for a conventionally Western narrative.
Yeah, and there's a problem with that. Well, I mean, it's done brilliantly, and Cormac McCarthy's wonderful. But what do we do with that? But also cognitively, how do we process that when that's fiction, and that's just one writer's idea of what might happen? Because it's so huge to process it's easy just to dismiss it. And I think our brains will automatically dismiss when you go, well, but that's just imagined, that's just fiction. So I worked a lot with theatre director called Katie Mitchell, who for a long time tried to develop a process to put this stuff on stage, to tell these stories on stage. And she, not to speak for her too much, but she felt that actually you need to really put the scientist who's been there, the guy who has been to Antarctica 15 times and has studied all of this stuff and has advised Al Gore on various things. You need to put him on stage talking about his experience and talking through the facts. And so we did this show, 2071, which was a dramatized lecture. And some people found it very helpful, and most people, I think, were really cross that it wasn't a play, and were really cross that it was undramatic and boring and full of facts. And we tried to do something radical and put on the Royal Court main stage the evidence and objectivity, and try to actually do the opposite of what dramatists should be doing, which is take the emotion out of it and try to just, in a dramaturgical argument, I suppose, this is what we know, this is how we know it, these are the questions left, and this is what people are doing in your name and with this information. So it's useful to know this information. And it was a year and a half of speaking to Chris and doing a lot of research. Chris Rapley, the climate scientist I interviewed for it, and then putting him on stage. But it was, as a piece of theatre, it was a total failure, and I think we knew that going in. But it is that cognitive dissonance about knowing it's a piece of fiction. I think it is tricky, and so maybe one answer is to set it in the present tense, because, as you say, it is happening now. We are dealing with the consequences of it. Frustratingly, in the West, we are dealing with far fewer consequences in developed countries than elsewhere. So our daily life is not as impacted as other people's elsewhere. Yeah.
I do worry about the trope of dystopia and how incredibly negative and unhelpful that is, and how we always seem to kind of, when climate does get into the mainstream, that's what it seems to be. And I wanted to share a quote from a brilliant young African-American climate activist who's part of the Sunrise Movement, and we were in a workshop together, and he said this brilliant thing, which has really stuck with me ever since. He's called Alex O'Keefe, and he said, utopian storytelling has to be the progressive left's answer to the conspiracy theories of the right. And there's something, I think, really profound there, that we've left open the space of imagining and others have filled it, and we've tried to come there with our facts, and actually that's not a space that you can fill with facts. And I think it's quite male as well. I'm noticing that as well, this kind of dystopian, fear-driven, you should be afraid, where I think a lot of the feminist movement around climate stuff is trying to bring a kind of, more loving, restorative, sort of different emotional. And Lily, you straight away at the beginning of this said, yeah, I think the emotional is incredibly important. And as artists and creators, that's our job, right, is to help to do that. What are your reflections on dystopia?
I was thinking when you guys were talking about The Handmaid's Tale, which I think is amazing, and has kind of, that's because it's very environmental, really. It's like how the environmental movement can be just how connected it is to feminism and feminist issues, and also how it could be used. And I think they have their place, dystopians, because they can kind of wake you up to like, I don't want to be in that society. How do I avoid it? But I think it's so important. We also have models of better and utopia. I loved Simon Amstell's Carnage. I thought that was a kind of fantastic, funny, utopian conversation about veganism. I was actually going to add a different point, which is I wrote my university thesis on utopia, and my book I'm writing right now is about optimism. So I'm on board with that logic. But what I was going to say is a different point I was thinking of when you guys were talking, which is that so often I think this conversation accidentally becomes about the environment or climate change as this like singular separate thing that we have to talk about or deal with. And I'd say most people, I hope by now, are like bought into the fact that it exists and it's a problem. And maybe there are kind of other more subtle conversations that we need to have because it's not a separate issue. The environmental situation we're in is a consequence of our culture, is a consequence of the way that we've chosen to model our lifestyles. And I was having this conversation actually with a couple of friends last night who are involved heavily in XR this week about, and I have full respect for XR and what they're doing, so I don't mean to critique them, but I think there's a danger of a kind of us and them attitude, which is like blaming the government or blaming the system and not realizing we're all actually part of this system and we need to take responsibility part of the system. And part of this system is this idea of, as you said, infinite growth and kind of, economic pursuit, which we are all to Greta, she's obviously in my mind, to a greater or lesser extent accidentally part of. And I think that's such an important cultural narrative that culture can play a part of, which is what is the kind of lifestyles that we are like celebrating? What's the type of way of being with one another day to day that we're celebrating? What's the kind of human culture we want to create and the value systems we want to create? Because those will in effect affect everything else. And it's harder and subtler, but I think culture has a big role to play. And that's your very utopian discourse. And that probably would end up being a healthier society environmentally.
Can I just say that whoever you sent that email to, I wish I could find them and ask them why they made such a big mistake. That's absolutely spot on. I think that the catastrophic mistake we made in 1992 in Rio when the first Earth Summit happened was we allowed the issue of climate change to be framed primarily or solely or overwhelmingly as an environmental issue, when clearly it is a cross-cutting issue. It's an issue of consumption patterns. It's an issue about our nature of our energy systems. It's fundamentally about our food system and many other things. If I can just take one example, right? Just to show you that what is needed right now is very joined up thinking and connecting a lot of dots, right? And we seem not able to do that. This is not the best example I'm about to give you, but please bear with me. Before I joined Greenpeace, I was a visiting professor at Uppsala University in Sweden. And when I arrived there, the guy coming to meet me was a bit late, and he apologized saying, "Oh, I'm sorry I'm late because I was on the Uppsala Bus Management Company board meeting where I serve as a volunteer." This is somebody from Foreign Affairs. So I said, "What was the problem?" He said, "Well, yeah, in Uppsala," this was in 2009, I was still learning a lot of environmental stuff. He said, "Well, yeah, in Uppsala, we ran our buses on human feces and we had a big problem." So, by the way, at that time in 2009, I looked at him so blankly. He said, "Feces, shit, crap." I said, yeah, I knew what feces. I just didn't know that you could run buses on feces. This was 2009. And so then I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "No, in Uppsala, we've run out of shit. So we're trying to negotiate to get shit from the neighboring municipality. They want to charge us so much for their shit as if their shit is special and so on." So I was intrigued by this. So the next day I went to the Uppsala Central bus station and I walked behind the buses breathing as deeply as I could to see if there was any, blowback in terms of order. It was absolutely beautifully smelling buses. So I then go back to South Africa, where my government then was trying to build nuclear plants with Putin. Thank God we managed to defeat both the nuclear plan and Zuma, who was trying to drive it. And I end up at the 50th anniversary meeting of the African Union in Addis Ababa. And so one of the big problems we have in South Africa, even in Cape Town, one of the most developed cities in the African continent, is disposal of human waste, you know, that same feces and the stuff that comes out from the other side as well. So basically, we got a problem with feces, we got a problem with energy. So I go to this meeting and I say to these are the leaders of the African Union, I mean, literally the presidents of Africa, various African, I said, I heard about this thing in Uppsala. I heard that in England, in Bristol, by the way, runs its buses on human feces as well. Actually, it's known as the poo bus, I'm told. So I said, as an African, I refuse to accept that European shit is better than African shit. We just have to get our shit together and turn the crisis of climate change into an opportunity. Because basically, if you look at many of the challenges that we face, actually, we're trying to, as you correctly say, treat them in silos, right? And by trying to treat them in silos, we're never going to make progress on anything. And we owe a big debt to the feminist movement when decades ago, they gave us this very powerful word, a concept, but a rather cumbersome word. Anybody knows? Intersectionality, right? Where they said to advance gender equality, you needed to understand how gender intersects with race, class, ability, religion, and so on. And similarly for every struggle, and certainly climate. I just want to clarify, I loved all your comments, by the way, and if all of you all write letters to Amnesty, I promise all of you will get things to do. But I just want to be clear about the contradiction that we are balancing here. We have to find that right balance between speaking truth to power on the one hand. We cannot lie to people. I mean, our children get it. I mean, listen, I've been so humbled by meeting some of these high school students. I mean, their understanding of the issues, they are making the connections, by the way. They're not seeing it as just, about carbon, or they are making the issues about north, south, the inequality in the world between developed and developing countries and so on. So I think it's about finding the balance about how do we speak truth to power on the one hand, don't sanitize it, but challenging ourselves. And that's why I'm saying that your role is so important. To be honest with you, if you ask me how to do it, I don't have the skill set to figure out how to do that. And that's why Jess has been helping us, and we've been working together to try to encourage as many people in your industry to actually take this up as a challenge to help us. How do we tell the truth, but do it in a way that doesn't get people thinking, well, it's all screwed up anyway, so why don't I just go chill at home, And that's the danger here. And that's why we have to also say that the journey of addressing this issue, we're going to make it fun, we're going to make it exciting, people are going to learn new things, we're going to produce new things, we're going to treat each other in different ways that actually enhances our humanity rather than an economic system that constantly is creating a handful of winners and a majority of losers. So.
Jess, I have a question for you, because you have been active in this space forever. Can you give us a few examples of the best movies or documentaries that you've seen that have managed to combine this, to achieve that?
Well, I mean, I kind of agree with Duncan. I think we're at a watershed moment when we need to really, address this and do this differently. And I look back slightly with horror at some of the films we've been involved in to see actually how they all fell into the same kinds of tropes. And we're going to need a massive diversity. There's a very good quote came from an impact producer I work with who said, we need a biodiversity of stories as rich as the biodiversity we seek to save. And I'm continually seeing funders and people in film who say, what's the next big climate film? And the answer is there shouldn't be one. There needs to be like 1,000 stories. And I wanted to quote another brilliant organizer that we work with called Mary Hegler in the US, who said, we need to put all other issues in context. Climate change is the context. It's what the word actually means. And it goes to your point. It's like everything needs to be located within it. And which is why I think we haven't talked about, and I would like to spend a few minutes also talking about how much at the same time as culture makers we're thinking about our own carbon footprints in the industry that we work in. Because I sort of agree with Mary Robinson that actually looking a little bit personally and making one or two changes, but without disappearing into guilt and the hair shirt. Because I feel like culture makers seem to be asking two questions. One is like, what is the carbon impact of the work that I'm doing? Could I be working differently? But also, have I considered what the climate relevance is to the story that I'm telling? Because there probably is one, whatever it is that you are working on. And it probably can be incorporated in that way, rather than saying I need to stop telling those stories and start saying a climate story. So Mary Hegler again said, we don't need more films about climate, we need more climate in our films. And it's sort of a bit more of a universalizing.
Oh, we need to understand, as you say, that is every single thing, because you said it really beautifully, like a story about Syrian refugees is a climate change story, but none of us would ever put it in that box. You know, so we need to understand that what Lily was saying, you know, that we're thinking in silos. It's one issue, whatever we look at it from each part.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Oh, no, and I actually have a question for you, and it's the thing that I now spend more time thinking about than anything, which is, you know, we made an Inconvenient Truth, I think, in 2005, which ended up being a disaster, because in 2005, it was very human to say we have to solve these things before the end of the century. That's sort of a trope that a writer would have. Well, that gave us 95 years. We should have only given us 10. But what I'm now haunted by, and the thing that I really wish someone would do some great social science on, is what is the event horizon for any given human being? Because it's not the same. It changes maybe if you have children. It changes maybe if you're a farmer. It changes if you're from a community that is facing rising sea waters. It changes if you're in Africa or if you're in Los Angeles. And we need to recognize that different people see this at varying distances away from them. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of story.
No, but biodiversity of stories.
Well, yeah, and I wish more than anything that we could understand, and it is sort of a social science question, of where does a woman see the event horizon for climate change? Where does a parent? And that's a conversation that I think we need to really tease out to understand some of the obstacles we have right now in reaching people.
I fully agree with you, and I think that folks in this community, including yourself, of course, have to help us. I agree with you that social scientists need to do some more work that help us figure out how to mediate that world, both from an activism side as well as from a creative side. However, you are part of creating the social science knowledge about it. You know, if I can just talk about one category that you spoke about. I mean, isn't it extraordinary if you've been following the Fridays for the Future movement, every country, who is 80% or 70% of the leadership in every country with the movement? It's young girls. Every country, young girls are in the leadership of it, right? That must tell us something. And when I've been troubled by this, I mean, I've been happy to see it because it addresses and it's not that young boys are not involved, but they are so visibly in a minority, right? And you know, the penny dropped for me a little bit, and I'm not saying this is the entire reason, when we were in New York at the march. And I saw, it brought me to tears, to be honest with you, right? I saw these two young girls walking together. They might have been sisters. And this one, and they're carrying up a sign saying, "Sorry, Mom, I'm not going to be able to make you a grandma," right? And by the way, this is a conversation I've had with young people asking me, do you think it's responsible to have kids? I mean, think about what we, as the adult generation of the world, have done to our children, that our children have to answer these questions. I mean, we have actually betrayed them already as a generation. Let's be blunt about it. And what's important about what you said, Scott, is a lot of the conversation around climate change as if it's something that's going to hit us in the future. Let's be very clear. The reason a conversation like this taking place in London might sound as if it's still happening is because the people that are paying the first and most brutal price of climate impacts are not the ones that have led the most consumptive, polluting lifestyles. Ironically, they are the ones that are leading the lowest consumption lifestyle. I had a meeting when we were in New York with Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, and he reminded me, we had lots of controversial things to talk about, but one of the things we agreed very easily on was the impact of climate. And he pointed out, already in 2010, 20 million Pakistanis ended up being internally displaced people when they got hit with a completely freaky, unexpected floods. I don't know whether any of you remember those floods around 2010. Right? 20 million people. How many of us remember it? Because let's be blunt, another thing about the media environment that we operated in, sadly, I would argue that the value of the lives of people of color versus white people is so drastically differently valued, right? That's something that has to be addressed, because I think that there would be more urgency right now if, in fact, the places that were being hit by climate impacts was, for example, Mar-a-Lago, this place in Florida. For example, if the Hurricane Dorian covered it, maybe it would have, woken people up. Because the way the most powerful countries that drive the decision-making around energy systems, economic systems, and so on, which your country is part of, are not the ones where the biggest losses and the biggest devastation is taking place. But be clear, we are losing, depending how you count it, we are losing in excess of millions of people every year, right from 2009 already, when the Kofi Annan Foundation started, capturing the number of people that were losing their lives as a result of climate impacts.
Kumi, we've got 5 minutes. So, please, I'm going to come to you to say whatever you would like, Lily.
I'll say one last thing. I think that was a really super important point to make. And I thought something similar when you were... I agree with what Scott was saying about the need for social sciences to understand how people see this problem. But unless I misunderstood you, I was actually going to caveat the idea of an event horizon as opposed to this really gradual, not that gradual, but gradual process that we're already in. Because I think that's a danger that feeds into the climate skepticism that's like, well, it's not an apocalypse yet, and if it's not an apocalypse in 5 years, maybe we're okay, and not realizing that actually some places in the world it is almost apocalyptic, and that we're on a track that's going to get gradually worse, and there may be feedback loops and tipping points that make it look apocalyptic, but it's also quite likely that it's gradual. There's a great book I'm reading called We Are the Weather that comes out, I think, next month. Penguin sent me that I really recommend reading, and he talks about climate change as a cancer rather than a heart attack, and assess that it's like there will be a tipping point at which point we can't kill the cancer, basically.
Thank you. Livia, what would you like to say in the conclusion?
Write. Do beautiful movies to inspire us, because, my God, we are screwed.
And do you want to?
No, I'm joking.
Do you want to say a word about your work? Because you've done a lot of work with the BFI as well about production processes and how. Who's already thinking about their carbon impact in their professional work and having those conversations at work?
Wow, fantastic.
Yeah. But it should be, obviously, it should be every hand, and sometimes you need to be brave enough to be the one that brings that conversation. But Livia, do you want to speak to what you've seen?
We did. So we helped the BFI in 2000 I think it was 2012 or 2013, to write the ISO standard for sustainability in film and events. And we launched it in Cannes that year, and now I think Albert is still driving the sustainability efforts, because it is a very wasteful industry with a big carbon footprint. But I think we go back to, no matter what you do and who you are, whether you are the prime minister of a country, the CEO of a huge company, we're all citizens ultimately, no? So the way that we operate and we consume every day, and the curiosity, I think one of the huge hope that I have always is that through movies, through TV programs, that we become more and more curious. And then, being curious help us join the dots with all the issues that, all go under the umbrella of climate change. And that until today we have confined into something that is in a box that doesn't really have anything to do with us. I mean, I was having this conversation yesterday about the Greta Thunberg and the student movement, wondering, do we know how many of these kids who are on the street protesting then as soon as the protest is finished, go back home and maybe go to H&M and buy something, or go to McDonald's and eat something. And how it's like, it's almost, even in their mind, the dots haven't joined. So making movies and continuing, challenging this exercise is the most powerful thing we can do. And can we do movies on Instagram? Because everyone is obsessed with Instagram. Can we do like 60 seconds movies on Instagram so that,
Duncan, how do we...
That's a challenge for you too.
Duncan, how do we bring about a new paradigm of storytelling? You called for it.
Oh, I don't know. Plurality of voices argue for, fight against institutional racism and misogyny in the workplace, and listen and pay attention to people and try and represent other people and look widely and share stories and advocate for other people. I realise the irony of saying this into a microphone. I don't know. But what's exciting about the different ways in which we're receiving content and films and things as well, that there's more opportunities for diverse stories and telling them in a different way. Not having as much maybe anxiety about the kinds of things that get commissioned, that there's, I don't know. I wish I knew. I'm excited to find out.
And we wish you fun as you find out. Yeah. Scott, closing thought?
Has anybody here seen or read Paul Hawken's book, The Drawdown? It's a really interesting book.
Mostly written by a woman called Catherine Wilkinson.
And the interesting thing is, does anyone remember what the number one thing that he suggests is?
Refrigerators.
No, it's that women, women in countries where they're having 3 or 4 children need to be educated, because educated women statistically, and I love that fact, but I also hate that fact, because my concern is that some of these solutions also, you have to be aware of the culture you're going into. And in some of those cultures, there are a lot of reasons why women might be having those children. And so when we look at solutions, we also have to think and not, not be white, cisgendered men who are making these projections on how to solve this problem.
I'd love to talk to you about that afterwards. I'm actually on the board of Stopes International, which is a huge global birth control and abortion organisation in 37 countries. And I can tell you that when you offer women the opportunity to choose or not choose family planning, they choose it. And there's not much that's culturally imperialist about that. Certainly no woman should have any choice to have or not have children forced on her in either direction.
I only bring it up as an example.
Yeah, no, totally.
It's easy to project.
But actually, I was very excited by that part of the drawdown, that actually tackling patriarchy is, in and of itself, a really important part of defending the climate. And here to that.
I was, on Saturday, I was in Florence moderating a panel only with women about, that was entitled, Will Women Clean Up the World? And I was quoting Christiana Figueres, because she said it really, really beautifully. She said, today we know that in the last 150 years, humans have caused climate change. And we know that in the last 150 years, in power has been only men. So something has to change in the next 150 years, for sure, as a solution. And one of the most beautiful things was said by an indigenous woman from the Amazon who was here a couple of weeks ago through the Flourishing Diversity Summit. And she put the climate change, instead of giving statistics, in such a beautiful, simple way. And she also said, what keeps me awake, what motivates me every day is joy. I have to keep fighting with joy.
To fun, to joy, as we take on this existential thing together. Thank you, all of you. I know we're over time. They're looking at me, so we're not going to give Kumi a last word. But thank you to Kumi, thank you to Lily, thank you to Livia, thank you to Duncan, thank you to Scott, and thank you to all of you for coming.